Welcome to Fridays in the Valley at College of the Canyons. In this program, we will be discussing the rapid, monstrous maturity of California and Santa Clarita as adventurous settlers from all over the United States migrated west to make their fortunes. Please join us as we meet some of the fascinating characters who did the rough and tumble work of recreating this land in their image. California's geography, which we all love so much for its variety and incredible beauty, is a real nightmare if you're just trying to get around on your feet. If you think about the Santa Clarita Valley, we have two natural paths open to us, and they are not north and south. To our east is the high desert and the desolation there. Yes, it's beautiful, with a car, a drink, and air conditioning. To our west is the Santa Clara Valley and the ocean. Unfortunately for anyone settling this area, north and south are more important. The first Europeans to make their way into this area made their way up just behind where the current Olive View Medical Center is in Sylmar and trooped it over through to the Placerita Canyon Nature Center, or where it would be, on August 8, 1769. The difficulty of the journey can be surmised by the fact that it took the expedition 6 months just to get to California from Mexico City, and this was all area that was already under the control of Spain. What drove what was known as the Portola expedition was twofold. One was to replace the already existing Jesuit missionaries with Franciscan ones. The other was to secure California for Spain against any encroachment by the Russians. With those as strategic goals, the occupation of California was relatively small, with mainly a military and religious component. The distance was seen as too great for anything more. The Californios, the Spanish, actually mainly mestizo settlers, therefore lived in a form of splendid isolation, rich with a diet that would have been considered royal elsewhere, with enormous amounts of beef and a cheap native labor source. The isolation would not last, however. The American version of California is like no other part of the Union. We weren't settled for strategic reasons or by farmers making their way across the country looking for new frontiers. We weren't settled by idealists in search of manifest destiny. We were settled by people obsessed with their lust for gold. What drove them to this state was pure obsession, and it drove them through some of the biggest hurdles this continent could put in their way. There were 3 ways to get here, and each was a nightmare. One was just to cross the whole continent. It was a piece of cake until the settlers reached the Rockies. The Rockies taught people used to the Appalachian Mountains about what the term mountain really meant. Once they made it through, they came across some of the driest land imaginable. At the end of that desert trek, they ran into the Sierra Nevada mountain range, and that taught the Rockies what real mountains look like. If they were lucky, they got to eat a few of their fellow passengers along the way. And of course, as Oregon Trail taught us, dysentery was a constant fear. Then they found themselves either in the most desolate desert imaginable or on their way to yet another mountain range. Once everything was crossed, they got to dip their feet in the Pacific. Option 2 seemed much better. Take a leisurely boat trip down to Panama, cross 20 miles across the isthmus, and then get on another boat for a slightly more leisurely trip up to San Francisco, the best harbor on the West Coast. LA didn't have a harbor in those days. Option 2 sounds great, doesn't it? If it wasn't for the fact that Panama had one of the greatest collections of stinging insects on the planet and the yellow fever to go along with those stings, that is, Panama became a charnel ground for people coming to California. Option 3 was probably the safest. Take a boat to the tip of Tierra del Fuego, hang a right, hang another right, and take your very sweet time getting to know the coastal geography of the Americas as you fought the current all the way up to San Francisco. All of these voyages were extreme, and anyone with even a lick of common sense would give up. The people who made it to California then were the toughest of the tough, the orneriest of the ornery. Oh, who are we kidding? They were mean, mostly antisocial or even sociopathic, and incredibly dangerous. California soon became the most violent place on the planet, and since everyone was driven by greed, if they couldn't get rich off of gold, then it was crime or the next get-rich scheme. Cattle seemed promising, oil eventually seemed promising, the kind of agriculture that emphasized expensive crops seemed promising. Kevin Starr, the dean of California historians, called what happened here a rapid, monstrous maturity. We went from empty to bursting at the seams faster than any other part of the country. And after the get-rich schemes were done, the name of the game became growth and land acquisition. Henry Mayo Newhall was one of the men who headed out to California to get rich. He started off as an auctioneer in his native Massachusetts when word of gold reached him. He immediately booked travel on the fastest way to California, But as we mentioned previously, crossing Panama was an invitation to disease, and Newhall became very ill in Panama, having to lay up for 6 months to recover. He wasn't able to complete his journey until July 1850, where he discovered that most of the promising land had already been grabbed. Dejected, he was ready to return home when he realized that in the madness of San Francisco at that time, his auctioneering skills would come in handy. He started by selling his own possessions before moving into selling other people's goods. In 2 years, his import-export business was flourishing under the name of H.M. Newhall and Company. Seeing opportunity around him, Newhall jumped into the railroad business, where he managed to get into the mad scramble to dominate the railroad business that was transforming the country. He made his fortune scrambling his interest in railroad and land acquisition in Northern California. But in January 1875, he spent $2 an acre to purchase the 46,460 acres of Rancho San Francisco, which is modern Santa Clarita. This was land that had been bought and sold repeatedly after its original sale by the Del Valle family. Newhall's masterstroke was to sell the right-of-way for a railroad and a station for $1 each to the Southern Pacific Railroad. This gave access to the outside world for this piece of property and put him on the map. John Boston, a local reporter, argues that Newhall had insider information that the railroad was planning to come through here. Whatever the case may be, the acquisition gave Newhall an extremely profitable piece of land, but it came at one hell of a cost. It was July of 1876 that the tunnel cutting through the 1.5 miles of granite connecting the Santa Clarita Valley to the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles beyond was opened. The entire project took only 18 months, supporting Boston's assertion. But stop for a second. Imagine if you heard about a project today to dig a tunnel through 1.5 miles of granite. How long would that take? The environmental studies alone would take a decade, and the labor itself would probably take 5 years. So how did they dig the tunnel so quickly back then? Simple. They blasted with dynamite and sent in Chinese laborers to clear out the rubble. And they did it at both ends. Were men buried alive in the rubble? Constantly. In fact, the people in charge kept the number of dead to themselves for fear that an actual understanding of the tremendous risk would discourage workers. Like I said, the people here were wild. The railroad solidified Newhall's property, and with the discovery of oil up in Pico Canyon, Santa Clarita had a solid economic foundation. Of course, Newhall wasn't the only man to make it in Santa Clarita. In 1850, Los Angeles was one of the most dangerous places in America. Remember what I mentioned about rapid, monstrous maturity? Well, here in Los Angeles, it was combined with a particularly nasty version of racism. Essentially, the Chinese, California, and native populations had no legal protections whatsoever. Into this vacuum, a vigilante police force called the Los Angeles Rangers appeared. Among its members were W. W. Jenkins and Cyrus Lyon, 2 men, Jenkins in particular, who would shoot first and ask questions when they felt like it. Lyon had a twin brother in Santa Clarita who had set up Lyon Station, a stop on the Butterfield route, the predecessor to the trains using stagecoaches. This was part of the perpetual effort to make California traversable. Lyon Station was actually the first American structure in the current Santa Clarita, opening all the way back in September 1858. In 1861, Edward Beale, a character fit for the times, managed to get himself appointed as a surveyor for the area and set out the north and south route through Santa Clarita up into the Grapevine, where he used his surveying power to draw himself up a rather sizable chunk of land, today known as Tejon Ranch. In order to accomplish this, however, he had to carve a hole through the hills, and he did so with the same Chinese labor that the railroads would use some years later. Beales Cut became an important landmark in Southern California when it was completed in 1864. Part of the cut can still be seen from Sierra Highway. Meanwhile, Cyrus and Jenkins would find their way up to Santa Clarita, where they attempted to find oil. They were looking in the right area, but they lacked the necessary skills. It wasn't until Alex Mentry arrived that actual oil was found. Mentry, who had worked the oil fields of Pennsylvania, knew a thing or two and managed to find and exploit the longest-lasting oil well in California. Over the next century, the community would be filled with those who came to work the land, pull the oil out of the ground, and provided the services that all the others needed. Eventually, this area became a suburb of LA, but that suburb relies on some of the most important history of the California experience. These characters, along with many others, represented the special breed that settled this area and made this community possible. Most of what they did would be completely unacceptable today, and all of it came at a great cost. What we are to make of it, however, is seemingly irrelevant in the lives we now lead up here. The little path through the hills turned into the Butterfield Route, which turned into the railroad, which was then joined by the Ridge Route, State Highway 99, and finally Interstate 5. In another 100 years, Santa Clarita will be just another part of the Los Angeles megaplex that stretches from San Diego to Bakersfield. Place names will tell us the story of the people who made all of this possible. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.